and welcome to tonight's Bible study. This is our first day in the new book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1. Let me read the first 11 verses. We'll discuss a few things, then we'll read on and discuss as the chapters break out. Um, Ecclesiastes chapter 1 begins this way. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the stream come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eyes never has enough of seeing, nor the ears its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generation, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. The book of Ecclesiastes, like the book of Proverbs, is attributed to David's son, king of Jerusalem, or king in Jerusalem. And the son that replaced David was obviously Solomon. And this book is attributed to Solomon as writing this book, Ecclesiastes. Um, but it's different than Proverbs for many reasons, because as we see, um, the entire book starts with this idea that this is the words of the teacher, and that he's Solomon, the wisest man in the world, and his message to us in verse 2 we see is meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And now those are some very strong words for Solomon to write and to utter and to be passed on to us. Um, so let's think about this for a moment. What does Solomon mean that everything is meaningless? Everything we do, everything we say, everything we accumulate, all the knowledge, etc. He's saying it's all meaningless, everything. And unfortunately, a lot of us pursue a lot of different things. And unfortunately, some of us pursue the wrong things. And by that, I mean we pursue things to accumulate things. For example, he goes on by asking the question in verse 3, what do people gain from all their labors? And that's an interesting question that we have to ask ourselves. What do we gain by going to work and earning money? What do we gain from it? Um, you know, do we work for money? Is that the reason that we work? Um, because here's the thing, richer people work far less and have far more money than we do. Um, and yet at the same time, depending upon the person, I know two people who work in the same profession. One earns a lot of money and get rich, and one is scratching a living. Um, and what I've learned is, what do people gain from their labor? If it's just money, the thing is, money comes into our lives and money goes out of our lives. Um, the reality is work should be more than just work for work's sake and more for just, worshiping money. And so Solomon asked this important question is, what do people gain from their labors at which they toil under the sun? The reality is, and I've said this before, Everyone is born equal, and everyone, when they die, go back to equality. The richest person in the world, once he dies, doesn't own anything, and all the labor and money he accumulated is worthless to him. And so Solomon truly understands something that we don't understand, is that uh, fighting in life and trying to scratch your way to the top of the mountain to gain wealth and to gain other possessions and things, in reality is utterly worthless and meaningless. And the reason for that is because one day we will all die. And he goes on and points that out. And these are the words he points out: generation come and generation goes. Reality, every day there are people being born and there are people dying. And because of time, which stops for nobody, we will all one day die. So we come into this world as babies with nothing. And when we leave this world, the reality is there's nothing new. Since Jesus' life, death, and burial, 2,000 years have gone by. And if we do the math, 2,000 years divided by 20, we have had a thousand generation of people come and live and die, come and live and die. And what progress have we made? Solomon writes, the sun rises and the sun sets, and it hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows from the north, and it turns to the south, and it blows and returns. That in life, there's this repetition, this cycle of reality. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, is in reality, there is nothing new under the sun. We see everything have a beginning, a growth period, a decline period, and an end. And everything is that way. And we need to understand that there's nothing new. We live in cycles over and over again. Another way of saying that is history have a tendency to repeat itself. History, the problem with history is a lot of people don't study history to learn from history. We see the same thing happen over and over again. Today, we had a president leave and a new president come in. The reality is it just cycles over and over. We have seen the same thing. We could change the name from a new king to a new queen to a new king. No one individual stays in power forever. Because as human beings, because we're limited in time and space, quite often we repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. I could use hundreds, literally hundreds of examples how history have repeated itself. I'll just start with America itself rather than go back all through history. But reality, we can see the same thing. Empires rise and empires decline. But in America, we see that if you look at the wars in America, we have a war about every 20 years. And it's no accident that there's a war about every 20 years. And the reason is a generation is 20 years. And you have a group of young men at that age, they go to war, and then 20 years later, those people who were born, they go to war. And it's a repetitive history over and over and over again. And Solomon is saying it's all meaningless. War, what are they fighting for? For glory, for their rulers, because their leaders decided? A lot of what we fight about is worthless. As a matter of fact, here's one of the things that I like to say. Will anybody remember this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Reality is most people won't remember. And here people invest their time, their life, their energy, and all these things for what? He gives examples, Solomon does. It says, all streams flow into the sea, yet it is never full. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. We see over and over again, people repeat the same problems over and over again. And at the same time, we think that we are able to create something new. The reality is, we don't create anything new. I know that the scientists and such may think that they have created anything new, but as Solomon says, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. The reality is, and here's the truth that we need to understand, there's nothing new that is ever created. Nothing. God created the universe, and we as human beings merely take what God has and rearrange it in a new fashion. But everything has been created already. There's nothing new under the sun, no new knowledge. Reality is we are repeating some of the same problems over and over again. War, inflation, deflation, all those things are meaningless because it's just a repetition of what happened in the past. We can go back to Rome. It rise, it crash. We had the Roman Empire. We had the Holy Roman Empire. We had the English Empire. We had the Dutch Empire. All of these, they rise, they fall. There's a natural bell-shaped curve for everything. There's a beginning and there's an end. Those are the two parts. But at the beginning, just like a baby, it rises up, it grows, it matures, and then once it's mature, it starts declining and it dies. That is the way life is. The same thing. As a matter of fact, if you stop and think about it, a fruit, for example, on a tree, it starts small, it grows and grows. Once it gets mature and ripe, what's happened to it when it is ripe? It starts declining. Nothing stays forever. And that is Solomon's point, is nothing is forever in this world. Because we are human beings, we are mortals, we live in time and space, nothing is forever. And because we are human beings limited in time and space, all the knowledge that we gain die with us. We can write things down in books and pass things on, true, but even that does not mean that future generation will learn from it and grow from it. It says, is there anything of verse 10, is there anything which one can say, look, this is something new? And the answer is no. Quite often we think, for example, that the electric car is new or this or that, or even flight is new. The reality is we're just merely using God's creation in different ways. We don't create anything. We just rearrange what God has put here and say, hey, look at this is new. Reality is we don't create any laws. And I like what scientists say. They don't create laws, they just discover what is already there. For example, as human beings, we've been able to fly for about 120 years, more or less. The first time that they had flight was with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. But did they actually create flight? No, flight was already in existence. God created it with the birds and different things. But the reality is they did not create the laws that make flight possible. They just use the laws that are already there in a unique way to make flight possible, because the law of gravity is still there. The law of propulsion is still there. The law of lift is still there. All those laws already existed. And they just learn how to harness God's law in a different way. But we see that flight has always been here, because gravity has always been here, propulsion has always been here, lift has always been here. There's nothing new when it comes to God. And we as human beings need to remember that. As a matter of fact, Solomon sums it up this way in verse 11. It says, no one remembers the former generation, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follows. I stop and think about how many of us spend time remembering in detail things that happened 20 years ago. 20 years ago. I mean, who was president? Or 30 years ago. Well, stop and think about who remembers what happened 100 years ago and all the different details and stuff. Today we know that, for example, 100 years ago we had a pandemic called the Spanish flu. We have one now, we call it coronavirus 19. But the pandemic of 1918 was about 100 years ago. History repeats itself. But most people who were alive in 1918 had died. So it's not a new phenomenon. Yet at the same time, there are so many people running around like, oh, this is new. Folks, reality is history merely repeats itself. We have had pandemics before. And if we go and truly study history, we will see we have had pandemics, about big ones like the one we have right now, about every 100 years or so. We have these outbreaks, and one form or the other, that's just the way life is. And so Solomon is saying all this running around thinking that you can solve all these problems is meaningless. Ultimately, we'll see at the end of this book that Solomon point that only thing that is really meaningful is for us to get in right relationship with God. That anything else is a waste of our time and effort and energy. Because in reality, the only thing that we truly have as human beings is time. All our possessions we only temporarily have. And the moment we die, like I said, the richest person in the world, the moment they die, don't own anything anymore. Somebody else do. And that will happen to all of us. Let's continue and read on for the next rest of chapter 1 here for the rest of our time. It says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that was done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after wind. Verse 15, what is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. And I learned that this too is chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and more knowledge, the more grief. And so Solomon again pointed out that he was a teacher. He was the wisest man. He studied, he applied his mind, he learned as much as he could. He studied everything. He was, we still, after 3,000 years, think Solomon was the wisest man ever. And his conclusion is, what a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. And his conclusion is that it is God's doing. God is the one who created us, and he has made us the way we are. He goes on and said, I have seen everything done under the sun. All of them, all the things that we do, in the long run is meaningless. If you stop and think about it, nothing that we create lasts forever. I want to repeat that. Nothing we create lasts forever. The pharaohs in Egypt tried to create a crypt that could last forever as the pyramids. But even the pyramids are decaying over time. And long enough, the earth itself keeps changing. The pyramids will one day disappear. The highest mountains will one day be the ocean flows once again. And the ocean flows one day will be a high mountain and land. Unfortunately, we as human beings can't see that. But, for example, the Himalayas. The Himalayas they're finding seashells and stuff and marine life on top of the highest mountain. Because once upon a time, the Himalayas was under the ocean. And what's under the ocean will one day, because the reality, as Solomon is pointing out, it's all meaningless. The earth that God created, for example, the largest ocean we have, the Pacific Ocean, what most people don't realize, it's growing smaller, and that thousands and millions of years from now, it will no longer be the largest ocean. The Atlantic, on the other hand, is growing, and it will be larger. And geology has pointed out to us that once upon a time, all the earth was one earth, and then it split apart, and on and on. And the reason we know the Atlantic is growing is if you take Africa and South America and slide them together, they used to be one piece of land that was split. There's now a huge ocean. Reason is time. Time. We don't see the changes, and in our limited lifetime, we think we know all the answers. And that's the point I want to make tonight. We think we know all the answers, but we are not God, and we do not know all the answers. We do not. And ultimately, Solomon came to this conclusion that as human life, all that we accumulate, all that we do in comparison to God, it's meaningless. And unfortunately, too many people pursue the wrong thing in life. They pursue money, they pursue power, they want cars and this and that. And in the long run, it all disappears. The house grow old and worn out, cars wore out, everything in the long run. People accumulate great wealth and lose it. It's all wears out. Solomon said to himself, I increased in all this wisdom, and one day it will be gone. And he points out that with much wisdom come much sorrow, because the more he learned and the more he understood, the more he realized, you know what? When I die, it's not like this will continue forever. People can learn a lot of things, but once they die, and even the smartest people in the world, be it Einstein, Solomon, you name all the different smart people, their life ultimately came to an end. I know this is one of those books in the Bible that, a lot of us don't like reading, but the reality is Solomon is quite right. There's nothing new under the sun. We might present it in a new, different little way, but in reality, transportation is transportation, be it the horse, the walking, electric cars now, planes, you name it. We need to see it for what it is, getting from point A to point B. Transportation, moving our bodies. A habitation is a habitation. The reality though, we as human beings are limited in time and space in this thing we call a body as long as we are here. And the only thing, and it's towards the end, it'll take a while for us to get there. The only thing that Solomon's seeing as meaningless is to get into relationship with God. And gaining knowledge for knowledge's sake, worthless. Accumulating great wealth, worthless. In reality, Solomon, and I want to say, there's only three parts that we have. We have a body, we have a mind, and we have a spirit. And the most important part of us is that spiritual part. And the body and the mind one day will cease. And so, with that said, yes, we can learn more. Yes, we can grow. But ultimately, the most important thing we can do is make sure that we don't pursue the wrong thing. And that is money and things rather than relationship with God and relationship with others. I know we're going to end a little bit early because, again, some of this stuff is hard. And I know history repeats itself. And we will be talking about some of these other things next week, such as pleasure and wisdom and folly and such. So I'll end there with that and get ready for confirmation class.